Hello, this is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. Today I'll be providing my part four discussion on Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology in honor of Black History Month. Now I'll preview this. I previewed this section before after I finished the section on Plantation to Ghetto, World War, Great Migration, and Harlem Renaissance. So if you haven't seen this section, please go back to the previous podcast at the end of it, the end of part two of that discussion, and you'll see my introduction to the section. Section four, We Shall Overcome, the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975. And something I noticed about this section, which is characterized by such leaders as Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and Malcolm X, etc., many other leaders, is that this section was long. I had to divide it into two parts, like the other section. And even though it was only 2 decades, it was a era characterized by immense change in the Black community and in organized power by both blacks, whites, and Latino and other groups who were fighting during the New Left movement, which is characterized by this period from 1954 to 1975. So now, just to preview this section, I know I talked about this before. So we have what the case that was critical to this era was the Brown v. Board of Education case, which established that separate but equal was unconstitutional, overturning the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The Montgomery Bus Boycott. Montgomery is seen as the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. It was led by such figures as Joanne Robinson and Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks seen as the mother of the Civil Rights Movement. Joanne Robinson, an impeccable educator and activist. And there are many people who are associated with Dr. King, such as Roy Wilkinson, who the executive secretary and director of the NAACP for several years. The SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was founded by Dr. King in 1957. We've been over this. I'll just go through it quickly. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was led by such figures as Ella Baker, John Lewis. Freedom songs such as We Shall Overcome and Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. Ella Baker, of course, was a human rights organizer for 5 decades behind the scenes, but was very important. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the main political and moral leaders of this freedom movement. John Lewis was deeply embedded in the movement. He was in the freedom rides, the sit-ins. He was one of the most prominent protesters of this period, as well as giving a radical speech on the March in Washington in 1963. W.E.B. Du Bois was a blacklisted socialist for many of his ideas. He was an impeccable intellectual. Uh, uh, Near the end of his life, he moved to Africa, but many of his ideas, because he was socialist, which was influenced by past figures, were blacklisted. W.E.B. Du Bois, he didn't get to see the civil rights legislation, but in many ways, he's credited as one of the most pinnacle figures in advancing civil rights. Fannie Lou Hamer was an impeccable civil rights organizer who, at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, gave a rousing indictment of the oppression of blacks in America. Now, those figures are part one of the discussion. Part two of the discussion, which I'll do in the next podcast. First, I'll do this one. We'll start with Malcolm X, who advocated against capitalist exploitation and political opportunism against the black community and advocated for grassroots activism and unity. Stokely Carmichael was a big proponent of black power who replaced John Lewis as the leader of SNCC. Bayard Rustin was one of the main nonviolent strategists and the main organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. Floyd McKissick superseded James Farmer as the leader of the Congress of Racial Equality. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, as you see in this picture, were the leaders of the Black Panther Party, as well as Fred Hampton, who was one of the main leaders of was the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party and was very critical to its development. One of the biggest proponents of Marxist theory. We also have Angela Davis, who was a freedom fighter during that period, who was jailed, wrongly accused and jailed, but because of a movement to free her, she was freed. She wrote several books, such as The Abolition of Prisons, and she influenced such figures as Dr. Michelle Alexander, who wrote the book The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. We have the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, who were guided by Black liberation and Marxist thought to unite auto workers and other industrial sectors. We have the Attica Prisoner Revolt, which is a demand to improve prison conditions that took on national appeal. We have the very important the National Black Political Convention in Gary, a gathering of thousands of Black civil rights leaders and cultural icons, saying that the political system was failing Blacks and they must transition to an independent Black politic. We have the figure of Amiri Baraka, who was a cultural icon who was one of the leaders during the Gary Convention. He's right here. Here's a picture of him. And he was a prominent teacher at universities and a cultural icon. We have Henry Winston, who was a proponent of racial equality well before it was a mainstream idea, and he advocated a Marxist interpretation of race. So before we get started into this section on We Shall Overcome, if you enjoyed this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at IndiaInsightMovement. This 6-part series in honor of Black History Month in February on Black intellectual thought, beginning with an introduction and afterwards spans 5 periods covering 5 different eras of American history since the founding of the American Republic around 1776. This series begins with the period of slavery and abolitionism, 1768 to 1861, and ends with contemporary Black thought, 1975 to present, which concludes with the seminal election of Barack Obama to the presidency in 2008. These sections are based off the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. So, to begin, the legislative triumph of the Brown v. Board of Education decision of May 1954 had not just overturned the separate but equal precedent of the past 6 decades, it was also a realization of a long legal battle led by the NAACP and liberal integrationist leaders such as A. Philip Randolph and Walter White to outlaw segregation throughout the federal government and in all publicly funded institutions. The overall goal for the desegregation of public life saw critical victories, especially in Alabama, in such places as Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, but these events were merely part and parcel of larger socioeconomic, cultural, and political transformations of American race relations between World War II and the Vietnam War. The Harlem Renaissance, Great Migration, and organized labor movement of the previous period set the foundation for racial shifts that seem more symbolic than substantive. The left-wing movement to desegregate professional baseball in 1947, the de-racialization of popular music, and the growing recognition of jazz as America's true classical music, the popularity of Black poets and novelists such as Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, and the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Black diplomat Ralph Bunche. Blacks also started to become not merely more involved in organized labor, but especially were offered more inclusion into the U.S. economy as seen through employment and mid-level corporate management, while also being critical to Democratic Party political victories, seen through their critical margin of victory in the election of Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy. Dr. Marable and Dr. Mullings insist that grassroots movements of the era were critical in the shift in participatory democracy that eventually took place, as all that was needed was massive social pressure from below that would carry the state to carry out racial reforms that were by now long overdue. And this was very characteristic of this era. It was becoming clearer every day that Jim Crow policies put American corporations at an economic disadvantage, especially in global markets. This would be instrumental in the hiring of a multinational and multiracial workforce, especially Blacks, because change had to come. It was only a question of how much and how soon. Centrist organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, organized in 1957 by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the more moderate elements of the white establishment, especially in the North, were not social revolutionaries. They did not want to destroy the system. They wanted to become fully assimilated in it. The tension existing in this approach was that abolishing race as a social category would lead to the diminishment of white privileges and advantages. The idea that the middle-class whites would accept this at the end of Jim Crow was incomprehensible, especially in the South. Blacks sought not only greater opportunity in typically white-operated institutions such as universities, companies, and government agencies, but also wanted access to more resources, employment, credit, and capital from a system that historically limited such opportunities due to racial discrimination. However, the SCLC not just sought economic advantages, but also political advancement, particularly achieving full citizenship rights, equality, and the integration of the Negro in all aspects of American life. SCLC's political action revolves around 2 main focal points: the use of nonviolent philosophy as a means of creative protest, and securing the right of ballot for every citizen. Dr. King, whose lessons from the failed organized campaign in Albany that he initiated, led a successful campaign to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. In the same year, Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech delivered during the March on Washington summarizes his moral philosophy and political goals. More importantly, Dr. King recognized from the Black struggle in America as well as the struggle against colonialism that privileged groups rarely give up their privileges without strong resistance. However, many Blacks disagreed with how the beloved community, coined by such nonviolent strategists as Reverend Dr. King and Reverend James Lawson, would be achieved. The heirs of the more left-wing radical revolutionaries, including such icons as Henry Highland Garnet, Ida B. Wells Barnett, William Monroe Trotter, and Paul Robeson, viewed integration as a means, not an end. Other contemporaries of Dr. King were not just more radical, but were insisting on a grassroots approach rather than top-down leadership. This included one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, John Lewis, as well as Ella Baker. SNCC viewed itself as a catalyst for change through an understanding that the masses would make history, not charismatic preachers and politicians. Ella Baker shared this sentiment towards grassroots change, viewing not just the imposition of one leader as troublesome, but also believed organizations should represent the masses, not the bourgeoisie. As Ella Baker's article of June 1960 suggested, the Black freedom movement should move towards group-centered leadership rather than towards a leader-centered group pattern of organization. Many Blacks were still dissatisfied even with the seminal passing of the 1964 Civil Rights legislation and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, because these laws did not fundamentally transform the economic and political inequality that was deep-seated in American life. This discontent is best evidenced by several Black rebellions occurring throughout America in the summer of 1964, followed by riots in such places as Watts in 1965 and Detroit in 1967. This eventually led to the rise in the philosophy of Black power over the integrationist philosophy of the civil rights movement, but the authors point out its limited influence as, despite its popularity as a public slogan, however, Black power never consolidated itself as a coherent social philosophy or strategy. However, even though Black nationalism sought to develop separate institutions, reject alliances with whites, oppose assimilation, and develop a culture and value system based on African American traditions, there were also 5 distinct yet overlapping expressions of Black power that arose especially in the late 1960s as the divide between Black and whites grew. These expressions of the Black Power movement include conservative Black nationalism or Black capitalism, cultural nationalism, religious nationalism, revolutionary nationalism, and Black electoral political activism. The Black capitalist approach was advocated by some organizations like CORE with ties to the Republican Party, even to the extent that Richard Nixon endorsed this approach in his 1968 presidential campaign. Cultural nationalism parallels many of the ideas of Malcolm X expressed by Baraka's Congress of African People. As nationalists and Pan-Africanists, we must understand that we must move to have self-determination, self-sufficiency, self-respect, and self-defense wherever we exist in large numbers, whether it is Chicago or Johannesburg. There are 2 Black power groups that are particularly prominent during their heyday. The first revolutionary nationalist group that emerged in the 1960s were the Black Panthers, founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. Their confrontation with police, free breakfast programs for kids, free health clinics, and theoretical education, as expressed through their 10-point program, made them politically influential, not just during their time, but also for generations of young activists to come. One of the most prominent leaders of the Black Panther Party, the head of their Illinois chapter, Fred Hampton, empathized with many of the sentiments shared by the Communist Party in America, particularly that the root of race exploitation is seated in capitalist domination over the proletariat. The second Black Power group with the most influence by the mid-1970s were Black elected officials. With the passing of the Voting Rights Act, the number of Black elected officials increased to 3,500 by 1975 from 200 in 1965. The authors note that the number of African Americans in Congress tripled, and in 1971, the Congressional Black Caucus was established. The Gary Convention was the height of Black political consciousness and provided a unity of radical perspectives, as indicated by its rousing indictment that the American system does not work for the masses of our people, and it cannot be made to work without fundamental change. With the growth of the middle class, Black political aspirations were not only synthesized into politics, but this synthesis was aided by the election to office by many of the Black freedom fighters of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s. The beginning of the modern civil rights movement that started with the Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955 to 1956 not only drew national attention and led to the emergence of Dr. King to the head of the movement, but is also spearheaded by 2 women. Joanne Gibson, born in Georgia, and Rosa Parks, born in Tuskegee, Alabama. Robson earned an MA in English at Atlanta University, became president of the Women's Political Council of Montgomery, and was critical as a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association in protesting segregation on buses. Rosa Parks was a seamstress and was an active member of the NAACP when she broke a local segregation ordinance on December 1st, 1955, by refusing to give up her seat to a bus to a white man. Her arrest sparked the boycott while also earning Parks the title Mother of the Civil Rights Movement. The authors dictate that Parks subsequently was employed by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Detroit, Michigan, and later worked for Congressman John Coyers Jr. There were other liberal and integrationist figures also involved in the civil rights movement that, as time went on, would be crucial to the movement, but would see their influence wane with a whole new generation of activists. Roy Wilkins, born in St. Louis, Missouri, was a critical figure in the civil rights movement. As a writer, he was the editor of the University of Minnesota School Paper, while as the assistant executive secretary of the NAACP. He succeeded W.E.B. Du Bois as editor of the organization's official journal, Crisis. As the executive secretary of the NAACP in 1955, he contributed to the civil rights movement. The NAACP and Wilkins began to lose influence due to two outcomes. One, as Black Power emerged and began to influence a new generation of activists, the integrationist perspective weakened. Two, the emergence of the Congressional Black Caucus and newly elected Black mayors in the 1970s diminished the impact of the NAACP. Later, the authors note that Wilkins subsequently served as chairman of the Leadership Council on Civil Rights and as a trustee and board member of many important organizations. As an advocate of justice and fairness for blacks in the South against voracious politicians, Wilkins declared that United States senators cannot go about the country preaching lawless defiance of courts and constitutional government without sharing the responsibility for the violence that may ensue. He also speaks to the quiet Christian courage of the civil rights leaders, defying the unjust laws of the Jim Crow South, and what resounding influence and impact it will have, especially on young people, whereby if these men of God go to jail, there's a good chance that thousands of the country will follow them into similar jails for similar crimes. Wilkins is disheartened that many blacks still act as if the 1857 Supreme Court ruling of the Dred Scott case is still reality, and that the end of Jim Crow and Southern segregation can only come at the hands of the leaders of Southern opinion. He is hopeful that they will take the right choice rather than the easy path. I would like to discuss some of the aspects of the Southern Christian Leader Conference, deeper aspects, mentioned in the introduction of this essay. The authors describe the tremendous resistance allowing voter registration for blacks as poll taxes, long-form questionnaires, harassment, economic reprisal, and sometimes death met those who dare to seek the exercise of the ballot. Some of the foundational ideas of the civil disobedience movement propagated by such civil rights leaders as Dr. King is illustrated as he who openly disobeys a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty is giving evidence that he so respects the law that he belongs in jail until it is changed. Such an attitude not only takes reverence and discipline, but tremendous courage, which is hopefully aided by solidarity with others, as Roy Wilkins describes. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which emerged in 1960 in Raleigh, North Carolina under the leadership of Ella Baker, was closely associated with the SCLC and was tremendously important to voter registration drives. The authors discuss one of the paradigm shifts for SNCC, whereby, though the organization experienced success in this capacity, many SNCC workers also grew disenchanted with both organized white violence they encountered and the lack of federal support for their efforts. By the middle of the decade, many SNCC leaders began to rethink the philosophy of racial integration, and they questioned the continuing viability of tactical nonviolence. However, SNCC insists that love is the foundation of nonviolence, which appeals to conscience, and in turn nurtures reconciliation and justice. Freedom songs such as We Shall Overcome and Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around not only inspired the title of this anthology, but they also were critical to expressing solidarity and faith of those involved in the fight for freedom. Ella Baker, born in Norfolk, Virginia, was not only the principal organizer in helping students protesters establish SNCC in 1960, but she also joined Dr. King earlier to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. Although she worked behind the scenes, she is widely regarded by scholars as one of the central leaders in the Black freedom movement. Baker insisted that the civil rights movement was not just a recognition of basic rights and humanity, it also was a global project, as repeatedly it was emphasized that the movement was concerned with the moral implications of racial discrimination for the whole world. The main proponent of Baker's sentiment was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was the political and moral leader of the Black freedom movement in the mid 20th century. He became the founding president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, drew inspiration from the Black Church and various theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, and advocated nonviolence both as a way of life and strategy to appeal to the conscience of the oppressor. He was involved in numerous campaigns in such places as Alabama, Chicago, and Memphis, subsequently winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Near the end of his life, he shifted his political and economic perspective towards democratic socialism, in which he demanded full employment and social welfare legislation. These demands were most clearly expressed in his plans to launch the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 before the Poor People's Campaign was able to grow significant momentum. Dr. King insisted that nonviolent resistance does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. A more radical follower of Dr. King was John R. Lewis, born into poverty in Troy, Alabama. He not only served as the chairman of SNCC from 1963 to 1996, he gave a radically revolutionary speech at the March on Washington in 1963. As a student, he was deeply embedded in the nonviolent movement, participating in a wide range of sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches. He was elected to office in 1970, became an Atlanta House of Representative congressman in 1986, and in 1991 became one of the 3 deputy whips in the House, thus becoming one of the most influential politicians in Congress. Yet there were not just future politicians involved in the civil rights movement, there were world-changing intellectuals. One such man who lived a very long life, W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Boston, Massachusetts, was the most influential Black intellectual for 2 decades in America before he began to walk down a more radical path. He was censored for his racist ideology, inspired in large part from his travels to Russia and China. His ideas were not just blacklisted by the government, but even many Black integrationist organizations such as the NAACP censored him. The authors describe his disagreements with the U.S. government's blacklisting of socialists and liberals, whereby Du Bois courageously fought against McCarthyism and challenged the censorship of radical ideas inside the U.S. Du Bois concluded that capitalism cannot reform itself. It is doomed to self-destruction. Through his studies of Marxism, he concluded that equality was to be based on economic opportunity, which, as Karl Marx later preached, was the only real equality. He continues this train of thought with an analysis of slave labor in American history. Thus, from 1620, when the Puritans landed, until 1865, when slavery was abolished, there is no complete democracy in the United States. He also suggests government intervention into remedying the inconsistency in wealth and resources between the classes, because our labor and taxes fund the government, arguing that the distribution of income is a public affair since it is increasingly the result of public function. This idea of the need for a radical redistribution of wealth was an idea that began to slowly gain more traction as the liberal integrationist period began to wane in the mid-1960s and onward. Fannie Lou Townsend, also called today Fannie Lou Hamer, born in Mississippi in rural poverty, became involved in civil rights activism when she began working with SNCC in 1962. Where in Sunflower County, Mississippi, she assisted local Black residents in registering to vote. The authors describe her involvement in politics, whereby Hamer became vice chair of the insurgent Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and campaigned for Congress for Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District. At the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, Hamer provided a moving testimony of the adversity Blacks faced when petitioning and protesting for their rights. Following this, she established the Freedom Farm Cooperative and was instrumental in building a low-income daycare center and 200 units of low-income housing for a Mississippi community. Hamer, as well as many other women a part of SNCC, had a deep impact on Black empowerment and economic development, but they are significantly marginalized by male leadership, resulting in the formation of a critique of male leadership of SNCC called the Position Paper, Women in the Movement of 1964. However, one of the most radical and clear critics of the more integrationist organizations was Malcolm X. So I thank you for listening for this part 1 discussion on We Shall Overcome. What is very emblematic of this period is that there was a rise in the nonviolent civil disobedience movement, really out of nowhere. In large part, Martin Luther King, James Lawson, and Bayard Rustin were the main nonviolent tacticians for this period. And although there was a rise in the philosophy of nonviolent active civil disobedience, there was also a significant movement towards Black power by such figures as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, which I'll discuss later. Um, and unfortunately, the Black Power movement, though providing a very critical critique of the white establishment and white power, was not able to provide a comprehensive system as much as the aspirations and realization of the beloved community, and something which Dr. King called the revolution of values, which he wanted to have happen. And as we'll see further on, we'll see more figures involved in this movement from 1954 to 1975, who, although did not cooperate with the civil rights movement, were critical in shaping activists and culture, such as the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and other leaders. So thank you for listening. And tomorrow I'll be releasing my next video podcast on We Shall Overcome 1954 to 1975. Thank you.